We're going to continue working with standard form, and now I'm going to show you how to determine the zeros in a different way. So we've already looked at finding the zeros using isolation and by factoring and by graphing, and all of that came in Unit 1. Now in Unit 3, we're going to look at a question that you would not be able to find the zeros by isolation, because anytime there's an x squared and an x, you can't use isolation. You would not be able to find the zeros by factoring, because if you take the 2 and multiply it by the 1, you cannot find two numbers that multiply to 2 and add to 8. You could graph it and look at the x-intercepts to find the zeros, but graphing is not always the easiest if you don't have a graphing program around. So this method would work no matter what the equation is, and it is using the quadratic formula. This is the quadratic formula right here. You do not have to memorize it. You'll be given the formula, but you just have to know how to use it. This formula solves for the zeros in a quadratic equation, but only once the quadratic equation is in standard form, which means all the terms are on one side and 0 is on the other. If it's not in standard form, you'd have to use distributive property or collect-like terms to get all the terms on one side and equal 0 on the other. So once that is ready, what you're going to do is determine the values of a, b, and c, because those are what get substituted into the equation. The a is the number in front of the x squared, just the number, not the x squared. So the a is 2, and it gets substituted into here and here where the a is. The b is the number in front of the x, which is -8, and it gets substituted into here and here. The c is the constant, so it's +1, and it gets substituted here. So that means a is equal to 2, b is equal to -8, and c is equal to +1. When you substitute, it's important to realize that that negative there in the formula is not the same as that negative there. So when you substitute the -8 into the formula, you're going to get -8. So you're going to write x equals, so it's -b, and b is -8. So -b. So be careful of those negatives. That negative is not the same as that negative. And you have the plus or minus symbol, so you should be used to the plus or minus idea from Unit 1. The plus or minus is what's going to give us our two solutions. One solution will be found using the plus, one solution will be found using the minus. Then it's the square root of b squared, so -8 squared. Always make sure you use brackets when you substitute. Minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 1. And all of this is over 2 times a. Now when we go to the next step, you want to remember that when you subtract a negative, that is going to turn into a positive. So that becomes +8, or you could just write 8, plus or minus. And this is where most people will make their mistake, if they're going to make a mistake, this is where most people make it. The part under the square root sign. In brackets, -8 squared minus 4 times 2 times 1. I would highly recommend you using your calculator for that, because a lot of people mess up if they try to do it in their heads. So -8 squared minus 4 times 2 times 1 is 56. So that becomes plus or minus the square root of 56 over 2 times 2 is 4. And again, it's totally up to you. You can write that 8 as a positive, or you could just leave it as 8. That's the next part. All right, your next step is now you're going to take the square root of that 56, and you're going to round it to 1 decimal place unless asked otherwise. Sometimes it'll be a number like 25, in which case you don't need to round, but we can't figure out the square root of 56 without rounding. So in this part, because we're going to have to round, we have to use approximate symbols. X is approximately equal to 8 plus or minus, and the square root of 56 is approximately 7.5 over 4. So please don't forget that you need those approximate symbols. Now what we're going to do to find the two solutions, this is where you separate them into the two equations, one using the plus sign and one using the negative sign. So your first solution is going to be found by taking 8 and adding 7.5 over 4. The other solution is going to be found by taking 8 and subtracting 7.5 over 4. And lastly, now we're just going to evaluate this. You want to make sure you do the numerator first and then divide by the denominator. So first, in this one, 8 plus 7.5 is 15.5. And then when you divide that by 4 and round it to 1 decimal place, you get approximately 3.9. Then, in your second solution, 8 subtract 7.5 is approximately 0.5 over 4. And when you divide by 4 and round to 1 decimal place, you get approximately 0.1. So that's what you do. There's a couple of cases that you'll need to be aware of. First of all, sometimes the number under the square root sign is 0. So if this number is 0, when you take the square root of 0, you get 0. And whether you add 0 or subtract 0, these two numbers are going to be the same. So you can just do the same work twice and get two answers that are the same. That's fine. But if that is 0 and you know that they're going to be the same, you could just do it once. So, for example, if it looked like x is equal to 8 plus or minus square root 0 over 4, you know, that would just be x is equal to 8 plus or minus, and the square root of 0 is 0. And since 8 plus 0 and is the same as 8 minus 0, it's just 8. And then 8 divided by 4 is 2. So that's what happens if it's 0. Now, the other case could be that the number under the square root sign is negative. So you could get a case like this where it's x is equal to 8 plus or minus the square root of negative 4. Now, you may be able to take the square root of 4, but you cannot take the square root of negative 4. So if you cannot take the square root of a negative number, you cannot calculate this, which means there is no solution. In a case like this, it just means your parabola would look something like one of these, where it does not intersect the x-axis. In this case, it would look something like this, where it's just the vertex sitting on the x-axis, and So that's why there's only 1 0. In the case that we did here, if you were to graph this, it would look something like this, where it intersects the x-axis twice, once at 0.1 right there, and once at 3.9 right there. So those are the three cases. You could get a positive number, which means you take the square root and follow through. You could get 0, which means you just have one solution, or you could get a negative under the square root sign, which means there's no solution, and then you're just done.